Okay, you can go ahead and start whenever.
Okay. And so the beginning of jazz really started with slavery. And we talk about slavery. The slaves did a couple of different things. There were field hollers. Field hollers are when a person is simply out. It's almost like when you're singing in the shower. So they're just out, that kind of thing. And then there were work songs where someone would say something and then the rest of them would repeat it. You might think about the Marines where they're marching and some guy says something and then the rest of them repeat. So that's kind of the two musical elements that came out of slavery. That moves forward. The field holler gave us a lot of texture as far as bending of notes, moving the sounds all around, rather than just playing notes on a page like a classical musician would play. So the field holler actually helped with style. The work song gave us the idea of playing something and have it repeated, and that's very clear in the blues that you hear a lot. So with those two, with flexible pitch, flexible time, and the fact that you have this call and response type of thing, that was kind of the genesis of really the blues. So the blues are sitting, we're talking, in the 20s or so, but before that, it's really the country blues with the guy and the guitar in the back porch singing, and that's really where it comes from. Okay, what else we got? I can redo it at any time. I'm not very good here. Okay, music shifts to New Orleans, and New Orleans was what they call gumbo, throwing everything into a big pot. So, and in New Orleans, we had the slavery, African American slaves. We also had Creoles, who are blacks of color, I would imagine, with West Indian background, French background, European background. So we had that going on. And the mix of all that music and put together really became where jazz started. If we wanted to tag someone with the beginning of jazz, probably Louis Armstrong was the person who first became the most famous and moved it forward. Now we're talking about race in some sense. Interestingly enough, the first jazz recording was in 1917, and it was the original jazz band, J-A-S-S, not J-A-Z-Z, and miraculously, it's a white band. So the record labels thought that they could sell the music jazz, but they needed a white audience, so they have a white band play, and they even changed the S's, or the Z's to S's, to indicate that it's not the black music, but it's the white jazz. The music then moves from New Orleans up to Chicago. Louis Armstrong worked with King Oliver. King Oliver was kind of his mentor, a trumpet player as well. When they get to Chicago, they're playing on the south side of Chicago. Now, the north side of Chicago is all white, south is black. And there is that divide. The white musicians are hearing this music. They don't know what this is. The younger kids are picking it up. They're actually sneaking out of their houses at night and going to hear Louis Armstrong play late at night. They really, they're underage, but Louis and King Oliver knew who these kids were. And that's kind of how Chicago jazz starts, with white players imitating the black players. But clearly I did not say they played together. All right, where are we going? So, interesting thing about race. Benny Goodman, a clarinet player, famous in the big band period, actually was the first musician to have a black and a white band at the same time. So they played in Carnegie Hall in 1938, and they had Teddy Wilson on piano, who was black, and Benny Goodman was white. So this was the first group that actually allowed race, and this is 1938. So this has gone through all 40 years at least of this music, and it's now the first time that they did it in public. I'm sure there were jam sessions on the side, but the first public performance of both black and white at the same time. the big bands started in the late 30s, early 40s, and that was definitely music that was white or black. The white bands were called sweet bands, and sweet bands were just dance music, period. All white guys, no improvisation, and very stilted. It was just for dancing. There was popular music as well, like a Glenn Miller, that type of thing, would be considered the pop music at the time. On the black side, the bands were like Count Basie, Duke Ellington, and they were playing hot music, they called it. So clearly the bands, again, were all black or all white. It was very rare that there was any interracial things going on in the big band period. And clearly the audiences were for that demographic. Duke Ellington played at the Cotton Club in Harlem, starting in 1927, stayed there, I think about 8 or 10 years, playing every night with blacks, black dancers, black band, but only whites were allowed to come into the club. Where are we now? We're a big band. All right. Okay. So after World War II, the big band period kind of decreased quite a bit. The popularity decreased. The reason really was that there was a recording ban for 2 years from 1945 to 1947, so these bands really didn't have a way to make money other than touring, and they kind of died away. Plus, the world was different. The war was over. It was a whole new world. In jazz, Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie put together music called bebop. Largely, again, a black music. And this was exactly the opposite of what was going on in the swing period with the big bands. This was not for dancing. This was not for that. It was all about the players and how good they were. Literally to the point, if someone would get up to dance, they would play at a tempo that they couldn't dance to, or they would play so slow that they couldn't dance. So this was just anti-big band. These were small groups. The music was very, very difficult. Led by Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and again, here we go, all the white musicians came to hear them to figure out what was going on. All right, and then... All right. Yeah. Okay. So the next time period in jazz becomes cool jazz. Now, people think of it as West Coast music. You might hear West Coast jazz. Popular people: Chet Baker, white trumpet player, and it really became a music of the West Coast with white players. The music actually started in New York with Miles Davis recording a cooler version of what was going on, but that stayed in New York. When it moved to LA, it was because of the television, because of film, and it was really the music that sounded like the waves, and very calm, nice music. People like Dave Brubeck. So these are all white musicians. There really wasn't a divide racially at that point, but the reason the musicians were there was because they were making money recording music for films, so all those good players were available, and that's where that music came from. So we have West Coast all white. Then, about 1955, we have New York comes back with hard bop, and it's entirely all black music. So as you can see, it continues to be white versus black in every period in jazz. Now we bring up civil rights, and it's kind of interesting. That happens in the 60s. The music, jazz turns. They start essentially using the music to comment on society. So the music gets very strident, very, almost to a point where you can't even listen to it. And they're trying to replicate the feeling of oppression and, the civil rights movement. So people like Charlie Mingus and Ornette Coleman. It was that type of music. Again, a pretty black side to things with the perspective of what was going on against blacks in the 60s. I would say after that period, the black and white thing kind of goes away. As music fuses together, there was jazz rock, there was R&B. So I would say after about the civil rights movement, then we were pretty much into integrated bands, and it's been that way for the most part ever since. What else? Do you want me to do something over? Or,
Well,
see what